This is my presentation on the Battle of Britain. The Battle of Britain in World War II was between Britain's Royal Air Force and the Luftwaffe, Nazi Germany's air force, and it was the first battle in history that fought solely in the air. From July 10th through October 31st, 1940, pilots and support crews on both sides took to the skies and battled for control of airspace over Great Britain, Germany, and the English Channel. The powerful combat experienced Luftwaffe hoped to conquer Britain easily, but the RAF proved a formidable enemy. Britain declared war on Germany on the September 3rd of 1939 after Germany had invaded Poland without having openly declared war. The Polish army was defeated by the Nazis in early October 1940, following the Soviet occupation of eastern Poland on September 17th in accordance with the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. On April 9, 1940, Germany successfully invaded Denmark, a country which had declared neutrality, and attacked Norway without declaring war. French and British troops quickly descended on Norway, but were forced to leave on June 10th after the Nazis launched an attack on Western Europe. The German campaign in Scandinavia gave Hitler access to high-quality Swedish iron, which would be used for the German war effort until the end of the war. By an outright victory in Poland and Scandinavia, Hitler moved his armies westward, launching attacks on the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France on May 10, 1940. The German Blitzkrieg strategy, based on a combination of military force leading concentrated strikes on land and air forces, crushed France and its allies within just a few weeks. On June 16, 1940, the French government, led by Paul Reynaud, was replaced by Marshal Pétain. He signed a peace treaty with Germany on June 22, June 1940 in Rathons. However, the French general de Gaulle openly refuted the terms of the armistice and declared France to be a free country. This meant that Britain found itself alone against Nazis. After France's defeat, the Third Reich found itself at the peak of its military and power in Europe. Many neutral countries in Europe and Latin America have opted friendly relations with Nazi Germany. And Soviet leaders Joseph Stalin tried to avoid the Soviet Union being implicated in a European war and showed more and more signs of gestures and goodwill towards the German Third Reich. Across the Atlantic in the U.S., public opinion showed significant signs of resistance toward the direct American military intervention in Europe. As such, President Franklin Roosevelt had to delay any potential action, particularly given that the presidential elections were taking place in November 1940. On July 19th, Hitler announced to the Reichstag German parliament that he intended to negotiate a peace agreement with Britain. While Churchill did not directly respond to Hitler's request, Britain Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax brushed aside Hitler's summons to negotiate peace in a message broadcast by the BBC. Therefore, on July 31st, Hitler decided to postpone the attack on the Soviet Union, which was planned for spring 1941, in order to concentrate German efforts on crushing Britain and forcing the country into signing a peace agreement. This discourse of potential peace was not echoed in London, and with the new Prime Minister Winston Churchill preferring a strategy of total war. Churchill managed to obtain public opinion in Britain and boost morale and support through his memorable speeches, and immediately sought U.S. support despite the country's neutrality. Born at Blenheim Palace, Oxfordshire in 1874, Winston Churchill was part of the British aristocracy. He was a direct descendant of John Churchill, who was the first Duke of Marlborough. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a radical conservative who died relatively young, and Winston Churchill opted for a military career very early on, hoping to find glory in his chosen vocation. In 1899, he rose to fame as a war correspondent in South Africa, where he was imprisoned. After escaping, he launched a political career, earning the title of the First Lord of the Admiralty, the political leader of the Royal Navy, in 1911. During his mandate, he strengthened the British Navy, making it the most powerful in the world as the First World War approached. During the war, he was forced to resign in 1915 due to the failed Gallipoli campaign. He nonetheless lost his title and had to settle for the role of battalion commander of the British Army until the end of the First World War. In 1916, he commanded an infantry battalion on the Western Front. He then re-entered politics and took on several ministerial titles from 1917 onwards. He was chancellor of the Equerry between 1994 and 1929, and became less and less visible on the political scene during the 1930s due to his politics being at odds with the pacifism which dominated public opinion in the interwar years. He loudly denounced Nazism and just strongly supported British rearmament. When war broke out in September 1939, he was reappointed to his former position as political leader of the Navy by Neville Chamberlain. He was energetic in his leadership, known for his military expertise and his anti-Nazi convictions, and became Prime Minister on May 10, 1940. Churchill was undeterred and decided to continue fighting, rejecting Hitler's peace offerings. Because of this, Hitler launched a campaign which would become the Battle of Britain in July 10, 1940, to defeat the enemy in Europe, or his last enemy in Europe. Was born in Scotland in 1882. Hugh Dowding had a passion for aviation, and as soon as he was old enough, he enrolled in Sandhurst Military Academy where he earned the title of officer before serving in the artillery. After having obtained his pilot's license, he joined the Royal Flying Corps the following year. He was involved in the first air combats of the Battle of France. After the war, he played a key role in forming the Royal Air Force and helped the British pursue air aviation. But in 1892 he became Vice Marshal of the RAF and was promoted to Air Marshal in 1933. He received a knighthood for his services. When Churchill was intent on sending more RAF fighter squadrons to help France in May 1940, Dowding persuaded him to keep the RAF reserves in Britain to defend the home front, anticipating that Britain would be the German Air Force's next target. He adopted a shrewd defense strategy during the Battle of Britain as leadership of the RAF, using his fighter planes sparingly through the concern for his pilots' lives. Through the strategy, he protected his forces from being wiped out by the Luftwaffe and made any German landing virtually impossible. He retired in 1942 and was recognized as the Battle of Britain's military mastermind a year later, when he became Lord Dowding. He then died in 1970. Hermann Göring, born in Rosenheim, Bavaria in 1893. He was lazy and undisciplined as a child. As such, his father sent him to the Karlsruhe Cadet Academy, where he achieved excellent grades, graduating in 1911. As an officer of the Imperial Army, Göring was a part of the infantry fighting in the 1914 combats before asking to be transferred to a fighter squadron. He gradually achieved more and more air combat victories and became one of the Imperial Air Force's best pilots. When Germany was defeated in World War I, he publicly opposed the communists and Republicans seeking to power. He was forced to leave Germany and live and work in Denmark and then Sweden. Imperial Air Force's best pilots, and became one of the Imperial Air Force's best pilots. When Germany was defeated in World War I, he publicly opposed the communists and Republicans seeking to rise to power. He was forced to leave Germany and live and work in Denmark and then Sweden. In 1922, he joined the Nazi Party in Munich after an encounter with a man who would change his life, Adolf Hitler. He returned to Germany in 1927 when amnesty was declared and began working for the Nazi Party to help raise funds for German industry. He was elected as a Nazi political representative for Bavaria in 1928 and was re-elected 2 years later. In the 1932 elections, he was promoted to president of the Reichstag. He served as interior minister in Hitler's first government and in 1933 let his troops wreak vengeance on their opponents. He founded the first concentration camps and created the Gestapo, which would be then taken over by Heinrich Himmler in 1934. He was appointed as Air Force Minister in 1933 before taking on the position of Luftwaffe Commander-in-Chief 2 years later. It was in this capacity that he entered the Battle of Britain in 1940, promising Hitler that the British Air Force would be reduced to nothing in a few weeks' time. When he was unable to deliver these promises, he was excluded by Hitler and his popularity plummeted. This was all fueled by the fact that the Luftwaffe failed to control European airspace and protect against the Allies' attack on German cities. He was sentenced to death in 1945 during the Nuremberg trials for the part he played in Nazi crimes. He committed suicide in his prison cell in 1946, shortly before he was due to be executed. The airplane's design and cost played a very important role in the Battle of Britain. Britain's Spitfire being the most iconic, and it served a very big part to the war, with having a fast speed of 354 miles per hour at 18,500 feet and a range of 575 miles. There was a total of 20,334 total planes made during the period of the Battle of Britain. The man that created the Spitfire was by R.J. Mitchell. The price for each Spitfire in the first contract issued by the Air Ministry on June 3, 1936 was $4,332. The initial order was for 310 Mark I's. However, the Mark I Spitfire was not very good at first, but the Mark II and Mark III proved to be the dominant plane in battle. The Spitfire's famous elliptical wing with sunken rivets to have the thinnest possible cross-section gave the aircraft a higher top speed than most other fighters of the time. These wings also made the Spitfire one of the most agile fighters in the sky, giving them the advantage with one-on-one battles. Another plane, the Hawker Hurricane, was the RAF's first monoplane single-seat fighter, developed from designer Sidney Cam. Rather than the stressed metal skin of the Spitfire meant Hurricanes were quicker to manufacture, so at the beginning of the war there were double the number of RAF Hurricane squadrons compared to Spitfires. The Hurricane had a max speed of 316 miles per hour at 20,000 feet and a range of 680 miles. The total amount of Hurricanes made were 14,533. However, the Hurricane was slower and was outdived and outclimbed at all altitudes by the German fighter, but it had a better maneuverability in low level and could outturn the Germans' Me-109 at any height. The Bolton Defiant was a plane that could hold 2 people. It had a max speed of 304 miles per hour at 16,400 feet and a range of 465 miles to 600 miles, and it had a total of 1,064 made. The Defiant's only armament was 4 machine guns mounted in a rotating turret operated by a gunner, situated behind the pilot. It was intended to be used against unescorted bombers, and the rationale being that the German fighters would not have the range to reach Britain. It was assumed leading up to the war that France would not fall in any conflict, so it was easier for the Germans to reach Britain. In the Battle of France, Defiants had found success. German pilots mistook them for Hurricanes and were surprised by their rearward firing guns, but they soon found a weakness. The Defiants were extremely vulnerable to head-on attacks, where the turret could not be aimed effectively. They eventually stopped producing the plane due to the superiority of the Spitfire. One of the dive-bombing planes for the Luftwaffe, the Junkers Ju-87B, what the British called Stuka, was an effective ground attack aircraft, particularly in the blitzkriegs in Poland and Western Europe. The Stuka had a max speed of 232 miles per hour and a range of 370 miles, and a total of 5,708. It had a max bomb load of 2,200 pounds. Each Stuka had 2 sirens fitting on the top of their wings to add to the psychological effect of their dive bombing. However, at the bottom of the dive, slow and low, they were vulnerable to attack. They suffered heavy losses in the early part of the battle and were pulled out of action in mid-August. The Ju-88 was an upgrade to the Ju-87 with max speeds of 286 miles per hour and a range of 1,553 miles and a maximum load of 5,500 pounds worth of bombs. And a total of 15,100 were made. The Ju-88 was insufficiently armed and its crews were not protected by enough armor. It still remained the most capable of the German bombers and was later used in a number of roles, such as successful night fighters. During its course of the 3 years, the Ju-88 had over 25,000 changes made to it. The Dornier Du-17, nicknamed the Flying Pencil, was a reliable but slower plane than the Junkers Ju-88, and it could carry less of a bomb load than the Heinkel HE-111. Only 535 were made, but it had a max speed of 265 miles per hour and a range of 755 miles, and a bomb load of 2,205 pounds. Heinkel was fast, and it was thought it wouldn't need much defensive armament, as it would be able to outrun any pursuing fighters, but the plane had no longer applied by the start of the battle, and it suffered against many RAF fighters. Adding guns and armor only made it heavier and slower. The Heinkel had max speeds of 255 miles and a range of 1,212 miles, and a bomb load of 4,600 pounds, but only a total of 5,600 were made. It was the most devastating bomber for the Blitzkrieg plan. The Messerschmitt Me-109 was Germany's only single-seat fighter of the battle. Luftwaffe pilots were anxious about the aircraft's wing strength, and many were wary of turning too tightly in case it led to structural failure. The Me-109 was powered by a Daimler-Benz 601 engine, which had better performance than the Merlin at high altitude. The 109 had a max speed of 354 miles per hour at 12,300 feet, and a range of 412 miles and a bomb load of 550 pounds. The Royal Air Force formed as the world's first independent air force in 1918. The RAF had experienced a huge reduction in machines and personnel during the interwars years, and it was only in 1934 that the government agreed to expansion. The emphasis was on bombers, the thinking that the aerial bombing had the potential to win wars on its own. It was not until 1937 that the Air Chief Marshal Dowding was able to convince government ministers to strengthen British Air Force defenses with fighters. Aircraft within commands. The structure RAF were organized into 4 squadrons within fighter command. There were groups, then airfield-based sectors with assigned satellite airfields under the control, and then at each airfield the squadrons. Within each squadron is 12 aircraft, which are split into 2 flights consisting of 6 aircraft each, and then further split into sections of 4 with 3 planes each. Each group was controlled by an Air Force Marshal and then covered a certain area of Britain. Group 10 covered an area of southwest England and South Wales and was commanded by Air Vice Marshal Quinton Brand. Group 11 covered areas of southeast England, including London, and the commander was Air Vice Marshal Keith Park. In Group 12, Central England covered areas of Central England and North and Central Wales and was commanded by Air Vice Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory. And in Group 13, the areas that they covered were North England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, and it was commanded by Air Vice Marshal Richard Saul. The Luftwaffe's main role was an army support force. It had gained experience in the Spanish Civil War as the Condor Legion, during which time one lesson learned was that accurate bombing was not possible with the conventional bombing methods. This was seen to be particularly true at Guernica in northern Spain, where a bombing raid which had a road bridge as a primary target resulted in hundreds of civilian deaths. Now the Luftwaffe was being asked to carry out strategic bombing, a role it hadn't practiced for. The Luftwaffe's largest organizational unit was the Luftflotte, again composed of aircraft of different types, in contrast to the RAF, which had all of its fighters in fighter command and all of its bombers in bomber command. And in each Luftwaffe, it had a commander, a General Feldmarschall to be particular. Luftwaffe 2 had location of airfields in northeast France, Belgium, and Netherlands, and its commander was General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring. In Luftwaffe 3, its airfields were located in northwest and central France, and it was commanded by General Feldmarschall Hugo Spiteri. In Luftwaffe 5, its location of airfields were in Norway and Denmark, and it was commanded by General Feldmarschall Hans-Jürgen Stumpf. And in each Luftwaffe, they had 2 to 3 Flieger Corps, or a flying corps, and in each of those they had Geschwader groups, a Geschwader, which is a group of 90 to 120 aircraft, consisting of 3 Gruppen, or wings, and 1 Stabsschwarm, a staff flight. And in each wing, they consisted of 30 to 40 aircraft based at one airfield, which were split into then 3 or 4 Staffeln, or flight squadrons. And in each flight squadron, there was 10 to 16 aircraft. The type of Geschwaders were hunting groups, or known as fighters, destroyer groups, battle groups, and a dive bomber group. Britain had been bombed by Gotha bombers and Zeppelins during the First World War, when over 600 civilians had been killed, and it was feared that the future conflicts would result in deaths on a much larger scale, as well as widespread panic and hysteria. Measures planned to help protect the civilian population included evacuation, air raid shelters, and the issuing of gas masks in case of a chemical attack. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding oversaw the development of the world's first large-scale coordinated air defense system, which is known as the Dowding System, which relied on a constant feed of information gained via radar and visual observation being given to the fighters. Fighter command's operations were directed the battle by allocating incoming raids to the appropriate groups. Group HQs then allocated them to the sector stations best placed to respond, who then ordered fighters into the air. Anti-aircraft batteries and barrage balloon units were also alerted. The system's main advantage was avoiding the need for standing patrols, which required more aircraft than the RAF had available. In the control rooms, raids were monitored on large tables covered with maps of the area by members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, or the WAF. The movement of raids was plotted using wooden blocks marked with size, heading, and altitude, and were moved in position by long grouper sticks. The fighters' positions were also tracked on the same table to allow them to be directed towards the incoming enemy aircraft. 3 days after the war was declared, on September 6, 1939, Spitfires were scrambled to intercept detected intruders over Essex, of which 2 were shot down. Unfortunately, they were not German aircraft, but RAF Hurricanes. One pilot, Montague Halton Harrop, was killed, in the first RAF fatality of the war. The 2 Spitfire pilots were exonerated at a court-martial, and the incident was put down to a mistake at a radar filter center that had confused a returning British aircraft with a German one. The incident led to a review of procedures. It was a race against time for the fighters to reach a sufficient height to gain an advantage over the incoming bombers. Attacks were best carried out from above formation and from the direction of the sun to disguise their approach. RAF fighters were often caught at a disadvantage while climbing to the level of the bombers, being slower at the point than the enemy fighters providing escort to the bombers. When attacked, aircrafts would form a circle to avoid individual aircraft being picked off. Messerschmitt 110s were particularly noted for doing this. Another plan when attacked is they flew in line towards incoming Luftwaffe formations. As German bombers had mainly glass cockpits, it had strong psychological effects on their crews. The tactic was later abandoned due to losses sustained. Scientist Robert Watson Watt from the small English town of Brecon had been asked to investigate the possibility of producing a death ray based on radio waves. This idea was based on scientific fiction rather than science, but this led to the development of RDF, or radio direct finding, later known as radar, which used radio waves to locate flying aircraft. British radar stations were built near the coast, but the Luftwaffe was not entirely sure of their purpose. The Germans listened to the RAF fighter radio traffic during interceptions and knew they were being guided from the ground, but thought they were only locally controlled and not part of a wider network. They believed the control room were underground, so it didn't think they'd be able to damage them by aerial bombing. Most control rooms weren't, and were vulnerable to attack than they realized. The Observer Corps just stemmed from work carried out in the First World War, when policemen sent in reports of enemy aircraft via phone or telegraph. In the interwar years, the Observer Corps was established to provide an organized network to visually spot aircraft as they flew inland over Britain. But radar could not detect targets over land, and working in teams of 2 or 3, the observers were stationed in open-air observation posts. Using telephones, they passed on the following information: direct height, number of aircraft, type of aircraft, if it was friendly, hostile, or unrecognized, and if the aircraft could not be seen but were nonetheless heard, a report of their sounds was given. There are 30,000 members of the Observer Corps. Most were volunteers who combined their duties with full-time jobs. Around 4,000 were women, and there were 1,000 observation posts around the country. The Observer Corps are supplied with a telephone, observer instrument, a table, a tripod legs, a tripod head, tripod shoes, and a canvas instrument cover, a canvas tripod cover, sunglasses, binoculars, and a flashlight. Anti-aircraft artillery batteries had a very important role to play in hitting incoming bombers, or at least disrupting their bombing runs. They were deployed around important targets but were short in numbers, and their accuracy was not helped by the lack of radar assisting targeting. But aircraft were brought down, and perhaps more importantly, civilian morale was boosted by the guns going off during raids. The number of anti-aircraft in service was 1,797. But the the Royal Air Force really needed a lot more, as the number of anti-aircraft that was recommended was 2,377. The number of barrage balloons was 1,466, and a third of them were stationed around London. And the recommended number for those were around 3,000. There were 4,000 searchlights put in place for operation across the country, even though they pushed for 5,000 and never happened. When Germans defeated the French, some German commanders argued for a quick attack on Britain while its depleted forces were recovering. They wanted to use airborne forces to capture airfields, but the Luftwaffe had also suffered heavy losses and needed time to move into its new bases in occupied France. Hitler, however, explained to Field Marshal von Rundstedt that, quote, that I do not intend to carry out sea line. There is no bridge across the sea, and on land I'm a hero, on sea I'm a coward, quote. In the weeks following the defeat of France, Hitler showed no signs of urgency. There was no overarching war plan that guided German action. It was left to Hitler to decide, and he hoped peace with Britain would come without military action. This, however, led to inactivity in Britain, and Hitler now puts aside his plan of invading the Soviet Union to instead force peace with Britain. The German Navy had looked at the potential of a seaborne invasion in 1939, but it had not been seriously considered until first discussed in May 1940, when German Navy Chief Grand Admiral Erich Raeder raised the subject with Hitler. Raeder preferred the less risky option of setting up a blockade using U-boats, Navy ships, and Luftwaffe aircraft. Invasion was regarded as a last resort. It was hoped that bombing, which had been effective for the Germans at Warsaw in 1939 and Rotterdam in 1940, could force Britain to sue for peace. However, Göring believed his Luftwaffe alone would defeat Britain's resolve. On July 3rd, Royal Navy warships attacked the French fleet. Churchill had ordered the operation to prevent the ships falling into German hands. This ruthless action against an ally sent a message of Britain's resolve to continue the war. Hitler then issues a land operation, which is called Sea Line. Sea lanes would have to be cleared of the British mines, and the approach routes would have to be protected by German mines. The German Navy was, however, unable to guarantee the crossing, and it would be free of the British, and would have to guarantee the free of British mine threat. It was essential to the German commanders that the Royal Air Force, as well as British naval forces and harbors, were put out of action before any invasion could begin. The plan relied on the Luftwaffe's ability to defeat its British counterpart. However, the Germans did not have any boat that was particularly meant for carrying men across the channel effectively, and the British Navy was far superior in numbers and could easily destroy the mines, protecting the Germans from naval exposure. Reich Marshal Göring issued an operational directive entitled The General Directive for the Operation of the Luftwaffe against Britain on June 30th. It outlined the immediate aims of the Luftwaffe: attack aircraft industry targets, attack RAF airfields, its facilities, evaluate the strength of the British defenses, attack harbors, attack facilities, attack merchant shippings, and Royal Navy warships to cut imports. The Luftwaffe was expected to achieve much, and although it had not fully recovered its losses from the earlier campaigns, it still was a numerically superior force. It also suffered a major drawback. However, its bombers had not been conceived to be a strategic bombing force, and therefore lacked the capability to carry heavy bomb loads. Throughout the campaign, bomber crews were ordered to avoid causing unnecessary civilian casualties and some nuisance nighttime bombings. But this gave crews practice of attacking Britain, and it already had taken place in June and July on targets across the country. Luftwaffe figures such as fighter pilot Adolf Gehlen and Field Marshal Erhard Milch believed Britain could only be defeated if its fighters were first eliminated from the battle. They felt Luftwaffe operations were to lure fighter command to the skies, where they thought it could be in. In the beginning of July, the RAF consisted of 1,468 planes, compared to Luftwaffe's 3,848. That was about 2.6 Luftwaffe planes to every RAF's 1. The first phase of the battle saw the Luftwaffe attack British shipping in the English Channel, as well as other targets including ports, factories, railways, and airfields. They aimed to test defenses and find out how strong the RAF was. They hoped the RAF would suffer losses as a result of challenging these small-scale attacks, and that they would gain air superiority over the Channel area. These raids were a learning experience for the RAF as it allowed to improve its defensive systems before the main aerial offensive began. As a result of the Germans sending formations to the different areas at the same time, Commander of 11th Group Air Vice Marshal Keith Park learned to deploy his fighters in small groups. So as to avoid all his resources being sent to raids that were actually feints, raids had started on shipping in June and on July 4th as the first major attack and had taken place on Portland Naval Base. But it wasn't until July 10th that a concentrated effort from the Luftwaffe began. During a dogfight over the Channel, Flying Officer Tom Higgs of the 111th Squadron hit an enemy Dornier 17. Either through ramming or by accident, the collision caused his left wing to break off. He bailed out, but his body was found on the Dutch coast 4 weeks later. He was the first RAF combat casualty of the battle. Hitler made a speech on July 19th at the Reichstag where he outlined Germany's successes so far and appealed to Britain's end the war. His speech was reproduced in leaflets and dropped on Britain by the Luftwaffe. It said, quote, I feel it to be my duty before my own conscience to appeal once more to reason and common sense in Great Britain as much as elsewhere. I consider myself in a position to make this appeal, since I am not vanquished begging favors, but the victor speaking in the name of reason. I can see no reason why this war must go on. I am grieved to think of the sacrifices it will claim. However, Britain ignored the terms. Fear Directive No. 17 was then made by Hitler, and the Luftwaffe is to overpower the British Air Force with all the forces at its command. In the shortest possible time, Adolf Hitler, on August 1st, earliest orders had targeted coastal ports and British ships, and now the RAF was to be attacked. And its airfields and aircraft, and followed by armament factories and then harbors, leaving those needed for the invasion. Shipping attacks were to be reduced. The Luftwaffe was to be ready to support the invasion. Hitler's orders stated that the intensification of the air war may commence on or after August 5th. The exact time is to be decided by the Luftwaffe after the completion of preparation in the light of the weather. On July 6th, Goring and his commanders agreed a strategy to destroy fighter command in the southern Britain in 4 days. The Luftwaffe interpreted Directive No. 17 as meaning of fighter command was the chief priority and targets that might aid the landing could be given lower priority. Once the aerial defenses had been eliminated, the factories and other military targets would be attacked. The offensive was to be called Adlerangriff, or Eagle Attack, and would begin on Adler Tag, which is Eagle Day. In the first phase of the battle, the Luftwaffe lost 309 aircraft and 519 aircrew, whereas the RAF lost 163 aircraft and 123 airmen. August 12th, the Luftwaffe changed their focus and attacked forward RAF airfields and radar stations. Large formations would attack and disperse targets at the same time. The strategy was designed to stretch fighter command's resources to breaking point. By August 10th, the number of single-engine fighters available for the RAF is 749, where the Luftwaffe had 805. These RAF aircraft were stationed around Britain, while the Luftwaffes were concentrated just across the Channel. On the 12th of August, a low-level raid was saw by the Messerschmitt 110s as they flow down the Channel, then suddenly turn in towards the radar station targets on the south coast. They destroyed 3 out of the 4 of them. A gap was thereby created in the defense system, which allowed following formations through that same day. The airfields at Lymph and Hocking were also hit, then the city of Portsmouth. While the 3 radar stations that had been hit were being put back into operation, the hours that followed, and another Ventnor on the Isle was attacked, and later in the day the RAF station at Manson in Kent was bombed for the first time. Dummy signals from the radar stations that were out of order were sent to give the impression that they were still operational. Having been postponed due to bad weather, the launch of the major Luftwaffe offensive now saw large-scale attacks on RAF airfields. Their aim was to destroy Fighter Command, although some Luftwaffe commanders were confused whether they would bomb them on the ground or destroy them in the air. This lack of a clear strategy led to a misdirection of effort, and airfields were attacked which weren't part of the Fighter Command. And raids in the morning were postponed due to the poor weather, but not all participating aircraft were told in time, as escorting Luftwaffe fighters were unable to communicate with the airborne bombers. They had no shared radio compatibility, and in the afternoon large raids were mounted, but it was not the glorious success that Göring had hoped for. The Luftwaffe overestimated by 700% of the RAF losses on August 13th. The Luftwaffe commanders assumed the RAF was weakened and planned to stretch it to potential breaking point, and raids were launched throughout the day on the wide front, from airports in France and all the way up to Norway, by all three Luftflotten. A day of the hectic action saw airfields, radar stations, and other targets hit. Despite their initial success, the Germans made a major mistake in not following up radar site attacks. Another mistake the Luftwaffe made was in not ordering follow-up raids on airfields. They assumed their attacks had put them out of action. This allowed the bases to be repaired, and flying from Norway towards targets in the north of England, and Luftwaffe's 5 bombers had to fly with Messerschmitt's 109 escorts, as the flyers did not have sufficient range. Messerschmitt's 110s acted as protectors instead, but they were not successful. From one unit alone, 7 were shot down, and on August 16th, Luftwaffe intelligence claimed that Fighter Command only had 300 aircraft left, but the RAF had over twice that in operational readiness. But the Luftwaffe and the RAF reviewed their progress on August 19th. Göring was perturbed by the losses, and Stukas were withdrawn from action unless conditions were favorable, and the bombers were to be escorted more closely. This meant fighters would use up more fuel and forcing them to turn back early, leaving bombers unescorted for parts of their missions. In the Luftflotte 3's Me-109s were moved to escort Luftflotte 2's bombers, and Luftflotte 3 was to concentrate on night raids. Göring also shook up the command structure. Notable fighter pilots such as Adolf Gehlen were promoted to Jagdschwader commanders, and the Luftwaffe's priority targets were to be RAF Fighter Command, Bomber Command, and aircraft factories. And between August 12th and August 23rd, the Luftwaffe lost 328 aircraft and 531 aircrewmen, compared to the Royal Air Force only losing 152 aircraft and 58 aircrewmen. On August 24th, after a spell of bad weather, the Luftwaffe began the next phase of major raids. The main assault was against RAF sector airfields, particularly those of Group 11. The Luftwaffe loss rate was lessening. Their bombers were being escorted by large numbers of fighters, and the vulnerable Stukas were no longer involved. The RAF squadrons were being moved into the front line, which suffered heavily as they followed old tactics and weren't experienced enough. On the first night of this phase, a nighttime air raid was to have major consequences. There were 6 large-scale raids, with some of the bombers forcing their way to the Group 11 stations northeast of London in Hornchurch and North Weald. During the raids, Group 12 were asked to provide cover for these 2 airfields, but only 1 squadron arrived. 19 Squadron, and its Spitfires armed with unreliable cannons. After more raids, Manson in Kent was abandoned from this day on as a forward operating base, and was only to be used for emergency landings and refueling. Its coastal position had made it vulnerable to surprise attack, and unexploded bombs lay all over the airfield at one point. Airmen had refused to come out from the air raid shelter. During a night raid, German bombers missed their intended targets of the oil storage facility at Thames Haven and the Shorts aircraft factory at Rochester. Their bombs fell on central London, the first time it had been hit, and 9 people were killed and 50 injured. Göring threatened the crews responsible with the demotion to the infantry. Churchill then ordered a reprisal of raids on Berlin. 81 Royal Air Force bombers attacked Berlin on the 25th of August, in retaliation for the previous day's bombings of London. Although the damage caused was not major, it was an embarrassment for Göring, who had promised no Royal Air Force aircraft would fly over the German capital. 150 German planes retaliated from the raid on Berlin and went to go bomb Liverpool on the 28th of August. This nighttime raid followed a day's fighting during which the airfields at Rochford and Eastchurch had been hit. The Luftwaffe again lost more than 40 airmen against Fighter Command's 10. On August 30th, the Luftwaffe employed a new tactic, where successful attacks left little time for the RAF to regroup. The sector station at Biggin Hill was subjected to intensive bombing. Kendling was also hit. As a Group 11's aircraft were fully committed, Group 12 were asked to defend its southern neighbors' airfields. However, bombers got through and the raids continued through the afternoon with no let-up. Power lines to 7 radar sites were destroyed, leaving a gap in the defenses. The evening saw no reduction in the Luftwaffe's effort, as the attacks continued with the Luftwaffe achieving an increased level of success. The RAF was under severe strain. They were destroyed, leaving a gap in the defenses. The evening saw no reduction in the Luftwaffe's effort as the attacks continued with the Luftwaffe achieving an increased level of success. The RAF was under severe strain. They attacked Biggin Hill twice, Debden, North Weald, Detling, Hornchurch twice, Eastchurch, Croydon, and Duxford. During this third phase of the battle, Fighter Command faced deficit in supply. Like the pilots, the workers were exhausted from their efforts during the summer. However, by September 6th, the Luftwaffe had a total of 413 aircraft destroyed and 454 air crewmen killed, compared to the RAF's 264 aircraft destroyed and 106 airmen killed. Despite the drafting in of pilots from bomber and coastal commands, there was still a shortage of trained and effective pilots, but Keith Park believed the RAF would be able to withstand its losses longer than the Luftwaffe. Despite claims by General Feldmarschall Kesselring that the RAF was on its last legs on September 6th, Fighter Command still had more than 750 fighters and 1,300 pilots available for action. 3 waves attacked and an aerial armada whose size shocked the RAF pilots rising to meet it. The RAF controllers were deceived into thinking the formations would split into smaller groups to bomb the fighter airfields, and were caught flat-footed when the German aircraft continued on to the capital. Hitler hoped the attack would force Churchill's government to fall and be replaced by one seeking peace. Göring thought that the RAF would have to defend the capital and so would come up to the battle where it could be defeated in the air. The target was East London's Docklands, and many of the bombers got through. The attacks carried on into the evening with the fires acting as target indicators. The Blitz, which would last until May 1941, had begun. There was 348 Luftwaffe bombers in the first wave, plotted at 3:54 p.m. And there were 617 escort fighters along with it. 23 squadrons of the RAF met with it. London lost 436 of its people and 1,600 were badly injured. On September 8th, Dowding and Mallory devised plans. Mallory's plan was to have multiple squadrons gather and attack together. The plan was to fight off large-scale bombings. Its strategic aim was for Germans to abandon their offensives due to high losses. Its advantages would be that they could destroy more enemy aircraft at one time. The disadvantages were that it took time to gather, and it was the only suitable against large-scale attacks. It was meant to be used after bombers had dropped their bombs. But Dowding's plans was single squadron attacks where squadrons would be in attack formation as soon as possible. Its aim was that the defenses maintained as the Germans would eventually give up. The advantages for the fighters were it could get to the bombers before they reached their targets. Another advantage was not all aircraft would be on the ground refueling and reforming at the same time, and more raids could be attacked at one time. However, the fighters were often outnumbered, and the big wing or the gathering of squadrons was limited in its success with its disadvantages, and it was limited with success, and its disadvantages outweighed its advantages. Fear of invasion was widespread in the summer of 1940, coming to a head in early September. Throughout the summer, RAF photo reconnaissance aircraft had reported the buildup of vessels in the Channel ports, and the bombing of London on September 7th was taken as an indicator of an imminent invasion. By September, defenses were well advanced around the British coast and had many improved upgrades, such as anti-tank barriers, barbed wire, and many other fortifications and traps. On September 11th, Parke ordered that the squadron should be sent in pairs to combine their firepower, with Spitfires targeting high-flying Me-109 escorts and Hurricanes attacking bombers and close escorts. He also demanded fighters keep to the altitude they were given for the bombers, as was common for sector controllers and squadron commanders to add a few thousand feet on to ensure the fighters were above their targets, which led to some bombers being missed. The second week of September saw a mixture of poor weather and smaller scale air raids. But with the nighttime bombings of cities around the city, the Luftwaffe thought Fighter Command had only 177 operational aircraft on September 16th. In reality, it had over 600 operational fighters with over 200 reserve. The Luftwaffe had underestimated the British aircraft manufacturing, and it had overestimated its pilots' combat claims. On September 17th, the invasion of Britain was called off. The RAF inflicted heavy losses on the Luftwaffe's last large daylight raid, which was September 30th. Between September 7th and the 30th, the Luftwaffe lost 468 aircraft and 666 aircrewmen were killed, but the RAF lost only 259 aircraft and 130 airmen. Due to losses suffered, daylight bombing by large formations of the Heinkels, Dorniers, and Junkers were halted, and they were switched to the night bombing. Smaller scale raiders by Junker Ju 88s were heavily escorted by Me-109s and 110 fighter bombers, which took over during the day. The Luftwaffe was not able to resupply its frontline fighter units, as the RAF had done, and single-seat fighters were at a premium. The situation had not been helped when a third were assigned fighter bomber roles in September. The Luftwaffe night bombers suffered a few combat losses. The RAF had no effective nighttime fighters, and its inability to shoot down the night raiders were held against doubting. It would not be until 1941 the Fighter Command would have useful night fighters equipped with airborne radar. As the month went on, the fatigue became a concern amongst pilots. Seen by the numbers of sorties flown in 1 week, there was over 2,633 Javas flown against London in October, and there was only 70 sorties flown by Fighter Command on the 23rd of October, the lowest in the entire battle. This was showing that the battle was drifting to an end. There was not a single RAF aircraft shot down by Italy's Air Force. As Mussolini was keen on his Air Force taking part in the attacks on Britain, Italian bombers and fighters were sent to operate from bases in Belgium the last week of the battle. But however, they suffered heavy losses due to flying in adverse weather that they were not used to, and their aircraft were not capable as others. They were still using biplane fighters. Between October 1st and the last day of battle, October 31st, the Luftwaffe lost 379 aircraft and 492 air crewmen, compared to the RAF losing 185 aircraft and 128 air crewmen. Fighter Command's pilots were never required to mount such intensive defensive sorties again. Night fighters continued to attack the Luftwaffe during the Blitz, but the numbers involved were much smaller. After May 1941, air raids on Britain lessened as aircraft were moved in preparation for the invasion of USSR. From 1941 onwards, British-based fighters were used in a similar way as Luftwaffe Me-109s had been in 1940, crossing the channel to harass the air defenses and encourage the defending aircraft to rise to meet them. But both sides lost heavily during the Battle of Britain. In total, over the whole battle, more than 1,500 Luftwaffe planes were destroyed and 2,662 airmen were lost. The Royal Air Force lost more than 1,250 aircraft and 520 aircrewmen. The Battle of Britain had a great significance as it was the first major setback for the Germans. It gave hope to the rest of Europe that it was conquered. But however, London had lost over 2,000 people. The failure to achieve air superiority over Britain, or later to terrorize the British into submission, encouraged Hitler's desire to move east. Even before the climax of the Battle of Britain, Hitler had signaled that his intention was to attack the Soviet Union at an early date, but Hitler expected an easy victory over the Russians, after which he could turn his attention to the problem of forcing Britain's submission. But his decision sealed the fate of the Third Reich.